Good morning, boys and girls, and welcome to reading again this week with me. Today I'm going to be sharing with you one of my favorite things to do at home, and that is to read. I'm on my couch with a cup of coffee, and I'm all snug and I'm all comfortable with my blanket. Okay, it's one of my favorite things to do. So I want to share my love of reading with you today. So I'm going to read chapter 2 to you today. From my favorite spot in my house that I like to read. So I'm going to go all the way back to the very beginning of chapter 2 and read it all the way through without starting and stopping. My grandmother. I myself had two separate encounters with witches before I was 8 years old. From the first I escaped unharmed, but on the second occasion I was not so lucky. Things happened to me that will probably make you scream when you read about them. That can't be helped. The truth must be told. The fact that I am still here and able to speak to you, however peculiar I may look, is due entirely to my wonderful grandmother. My grandmother was Norwegian. The Norwegians know all about witches, for Norway, with its black forests and icy mountains, is where the first witches came from. My father and my mother were also Norwegian, but because my father had a business in England, I had been born there and I had lived there and started going to an English school. Twice a year, at Christmas and in summer, we went back to Norway to visit my grandmother. This old lady, as far as I could gather, was just about the only surviving relative we had on either side of our family. She was my mother's mother, and I absolutely adored her. When she and I were together, we spoke in either Norwegian or in English. It didn't matter which. We were equally fluent in both languages. I have to admit that I feel closer to her than my mother. Soon after my 7th birthday, my parents took me, as usual, to spend Christmas with my grandmother in Norway. And it was over there, while my father and my mother were driving in icy weather just north of Oslo, that our car skidded off the road and went tumbling down into a rocky ravine. My parents were killed. I was firmly strapped into the back seat and received only a cut to the forehead. I won't go into the horrors of that terrible afternoon. I still get the shivers when I think about it. I finished up, of course, back in my grandmother's house, her arms around me tight, and both of us crying the whole night long. What are you going to do now? I asked her through the tears. Sorry, what are we going to do now? I asked her through the tears. You will stay here with me, she said, and I will look after you. Aren't I going back to England? No, she said. I could never do that. Heaven shall take my soul, but Norway shall keep my bones. The very next day, in order that we might both try to forget our great sadness, my grandmother started telling me stories. She was a wonderful storyteller, and I was enthralled by everything she told me. But I didn't become really excited until she got onto the subject of witches. She was apparently an expert on these creatures, and she made it very clear to me her witch stories, unlike most of others, were not imaginary tales. They were all true. They were the gospel truth. They were history. Everything she was telling me about witches had actually happened, and I better believe it. What was worse, what was far, far worse, was that witches were still with us. They were all around us, and I had better believe that too. Are you really being truthful, Grandmama? Really and truly truthful? My darling, she said, you won't last long in this world if you don't know how to spot a witch when you see one. But you told me that witches look like ordinary women, Grandmama. So how can I spot them? You must listen to me, my grandmother said. You must remember everything I tell you. After that, all you can do is cross your heart and pray to heaven and hope for the best. We were in the big living room of her house in Oslo, and I was ready for bed. The curtains were never drawn in that house, and through the windows I could see huge snowflakes falling slowly to an outside world that was as black as tar. My grandmother was tremendously old and wrinkled, with a massive white body which was smothered in grey lace. She sat there majestic in her armchair, feeling every inch of it. Not even a mouse could have squeezed in to sit beside her. I myself was 7 years old, was crouched on the floor at her feet, wearing pajamas, dressing gowns, and slippers. You swear you aren't pulling my leg? I kept saying to her. You swear you just aren't pretending? Listen, she said. I have known no less than 5 children who have simply vanished off the face of this earth, never to be seen again. The witches took them. I still think you're just trying to frighten me, I said. I am trying to make sure that you don't go the same way, she said. I love you, and I want you to stay with me. Tell me about the children who disappeared, I said. My grandmother was the only grandmother I had ever met who smoked cigars. She lit one now, a long black cigar that smelt of burning rubber. The first child I know who disappeared, she said, was called Ragchild Hansen. Ragnhild Hansen. Ragnhild was about 8 at the time, and she was playing with her little sister on the lawn. Their mother, who was baking bread in the kitchen, came outside for a breath of fresh air. "Where's Ragnhild?" she said. "She went with the tall lady. She went away with the tall lady," the little sister said. "What tall lady?" the mother said. "The tall lady with the white gloves," the little sister said. "She took Ragnhild by the hand and led her away." No one, my grandmother said, ever saw Ragnhild again. Didn't they search for her? I asked. They searched for miles around. Everyone in the town helped, but they never found her. What happened to the other 4 children? I asked. They vanished just as Ragnhild did. Ragnhild. I'm going to back that up. I am struggling to pronounce this Norwegian name. They vanished just as Ragnhild did. That sounds right. How, Grandmama? How did they vanish? In every case, a strange lady was seen outside the house. just before it happened. But how did they vanish? I asked. The second one was very peculiar, my grandmother said. There was a family called Christianson. They lived up on Holman Colin, and they had an oil painting in the living room, which they were very proud of. The painting showed some ducks in the yard outside a farmhouse. There were no people in the painting, just a flock of ducks on a grassy farmyard, and the farmhouse in the background. It was a large painting and rather pretty. Well, one day their daughter, Solveig, came home from school eating an apple. She said a nice lady had given it to her on the street. The next morning little Solveig was not in her bed. The parents searched everywhere, but they couldn't find her. Then all of a sudden her father shouted, "There she is! That's Solveig feeding the ducks!" He was pointing at the oil painting, and sure enough, Solveig was in it. She was standing in the farmyard in the act of throwing bread to the ducks out of the basket. The father rushed up to the painting and touched her, but that didn't help. She was simply part of the painting, just a picture painted on the canvas. Did you ever see the painting, Grandma, with the little girl in it? Many times, my grandmother said, and the peculiar thing was that little Solveig kept changing her position in the picture. One day she would actually be inside the farmhouse, and you could see her face looking out of the window. Another day she would be far over to the left with a duck in her arms. Did you see her moving in the picture, Grandmama? Nobody ever did. Wherever she was, whether outside feeding the ducks or inside looking out the window, she was always motionless, just a figure painted in oils. It was very odd, my grandmother said, very odd indeed. And what was most odd of all was that, as the years went by, she kept growing older in the picture. In 10 years the small girl had become a young woman. In 30 years she was middle-aged. Then all at once, 54 years after it had all happened, she disappeared from that picture altogether. You mean she died? I said. Who knows, my grandmother said. Some very mysterious things go on in the world of witches. That's two you've told me about, I said. What happened to the third one? The third one was little Birgit Svensson, my grandmother said. She lived just across the road from us. One day she started growing feathers all over her body. Within a month she had turned into a little white chicken. Her parents kept her for years in a pen in the garden where she laid eggs. Boys and girls, this is going to have to go over 2 videos because I can only record for 15 minutes. So to listen to the next part of chapter 2, you're going to have to watch the next video.